Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So I've been using the POCO X4 Pro 5G for the past 2 weeks, and I think I've had enough time to come to a conclusion on this device. So I'm actually going to go ahead and let you guys know what I think of this, my conclusion at the very beginning. And that is that I think if you're someone who's looking to buy this device, the POCO X4 Pro 5G, I actually suggest reconsidering and actually checking out last year's POCO X3 Pro instead, especially now given that it's been out for a year and there's a lot of discounts on it. The reason why I said it is because I think the POCO X3 Pro, despite being a year old, still offers a lot more value than this one over here. Now, having said that, this is by no means a bad device. It's still plenty capable in its own right, but if you were to compare it one-to-one with last year's POCO X3 Pro, this falls short in terms of value. Like, yes, there are some upgrades, but as a whole, I still think the POCO X3 Pro is a better buy. Now, if that's all you want to hear, you can pretty much exit the video right now. But if you do want to know why I've come to this conclusion, do please keep on watching and I'll let you guys know why. Okay, so the first and probably the biggest reason why I think the POCO X4 Pro 5G isn't as good value as last year's POCO X3 Pro is mainly due to the fact that the processor is, has a bit of a downgrade. If you guys are aware, last year's POCO X3 Pro had the Snapdragon 860, which is essentially a bit of a pseudo flagship chipset, whereas this year's POCO X4 Pro 5G has the Snapdragon 695, which, although it offers 5G capabilities, it's strictly a mid-range chipset, and performance-wise, it's nowhere near as good as the Snapdragon 860. Now, when it comes to day-to-day performance, daily tasks like browsing social media, doing video calls and stuff, it's honestly fine. It handles all those tasks well, without much hiccups and stuff. Although I have to note that there are occasional stutters when you're kind of like swiping down the control panel or accessing the app drawer or the Google Now feed. Surprisingly, a lot more than some of the mid-range devices that we used last year. One example is the Redmi Note 10 Pro, which actually had the Snapdragon 732, which surprisingly on paper is actually inferior to the Snapdragon 695. But despite that, I've had a much smoother experience with the Snapdragon 732 last year than the current Snapdragon 695. So I'm not too sure why that's the case. It could be possible that MIUI, as usual, it's a bit of a heavier Android skin and it might not be 100% optimized for the Snapdragon 695 yet. But regardless, it's still it's a decent chipset, but it's probably not my favorite. I would have preferred if they've gone with something like a MediaTek Dimensity 920 for the POCO X4 Pro 5G, or maybe even something like a Snapdragon 870 or 778. But then again, we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. It could be possible that because of the global chip shortage, POCO had no choice but to use the Snapdragon 695. But yeah, that aside, surprisingly, when it comes to gaming, certain titles like PUBG Mobile and Call of Duty Mobile actually run surprisingly well. So over the course of the past 2 weeks, I've actually played quite a bit of Call of Duty Mobile in like 1 or 2 hour sessions, and the device has handled it pretty well. Of course, given that you kind of tweak the settings a bit so that it's not at the highest graphic levels and all that. But honestly, the performance has been pretty good so far, and I haven't really had any issues. However, if you're playing more graphic intensive games like Genshin Impact, you might want to consider last year's POCO X3 Pro instead, because when it comes to Genshin Impact, you definitely have to tweak the settings a lot, and in prolonged sessions like 2-3 hour sessions, it's definitely going to get warm. So if you're someone who's playing games like Genshin Impact where you're playing it for like 3 to 4 hour sessions, doing non-stop grinding and all that, I wouldn't recommend any devices with the Snapdragon 695. I would suggest going for last year's POCO X3 Pro or maybe even the POCO F3. Definitely something with a more potent chipset. But other than that, performance wise, when it comes to day-to-day tasks, it's fine. Certain titles like PUBG Mobile and Call of Duty run well, but of course when it comes to more graphic intensive stuff like editing 4K video or titles like Genshin Impact, it's definitely going to struggle a bit. Okay, so another thing which is a bit of a shame when it comes to the POCO X4 Pro 5G is the fact that despite getting a better camera on paper, getting a 108 megapixel main sensor, the POCO X4 Pro 5G is actually not capable of recording 4K video. And again, this is mainly due to the Snapdragon 695. It's not really POCO's fault. Basically, if you're getting any device this year with the Snapdragon 695, just keep in mind that you won't be able to get 4K video recording capabilities due to the limitations of that chip. So that's it's a bit of a shame, considering that a lot of the older devices like the POCO X4 Pro and the Redmi Note 10 Pro, both of which were capable of recording 4K video, and pretty much launched at around the same price as this. So it's a bit of a shame that you don't get 4K video recording capabilities with this. And also something else that I've noticed is that if you were to go to the camera app over here and go over to more, usually on other Xiaomi and POCO devices from last year, there would be an option for the clone photo and clone video, which, if you didn't know, is an option kind of like a camera mode on Xiaomi and POCO devices, which allows you to clone yourself in a photo or video. And it's honestly really, really nice. It's really fun, and it's definitely a kind of like a party trick which does impress people, and it's by no means a gimmick. But sadly, you don't get it on this year's POCO X4 Pro 5G. And my theory is that they kind of removed it because the Snapdragon 695 isn't capable of handling all the processing. So that's a bit of a shame, that despite you getting kind of like a big upgrade on paper in the camera department, getting a 108 megapixel main sensor, you're losing out on 4K video recording and also some of the fun features like the clone video mode. Not only that, it's also kind of disappointing to see that even when it comes to just standard 1080p video in even decent lighting conditions, the video quality isn't the best. I feel like it's not as good as last year's Xiaomi and POCO devices. And again, it's probably because of the Snapdragon 695. What I've noticed from some of the video clips I've taken is that even in decent lighting conditions, there is a bit of noise, and there's obviously a jutter effect, which it's common on a lot of Android devices, but it seems a bit more apparent here. So definitely, in terms of video recording capabilities, the POCO X4 Pro 5G isn't really doing well in that regard. However, when you go over to just standard stills in a broad daylight, with the main 108 megapixel camera, it's honestly pretty good. I've taken quite a few nice images with it. Definitely Insta worthy. And of course, you have the 8 megapixel ultra wide camera as well, which it's decent, it's usable. If all you're ever going to do is just post it on social media, it's fine. But once you blow it up on a big screen or monitor, you can kind of tell that on the edges it's pretty soft, it's a bit of a noise. But if you're just posting it on social media, you shouldn't have a problem. Although I do wish companies would kind of move from an 8 megapixel ultra wide to something like a 12 megapixel ultra wide, kind of like what Samsung is doing with the A53, having a 12 megapixel ultra wide. I think it's about time we do that. But for now, we're still getting the 8 megapixel ultra wide sensors. When it comes to the software experience on the POCO X4 Pro 5G, my experience has been pretty good so far, apart from some minor gripes. One of it being, as I mentioned before, there are occasional stutters when you're kind of accessing the Google Now feed or kind of accessing the app drawer. But then again, it's kind of to be expected, especially since the Snapdragon 695 might not be that well optimized as some older mid-range chipsets like the Snapdragon 732. And another thing which might be a deal breaker for some people is the fact that the POCO X4 Pro 5G actually ships with Android 11 instead of Android 12. Now, this is a bit of a weird decision. I'm not too sure why they decided to do this, given that there are devices from other companies right now, from Oppo and stuff, which do ship with Android 12. So depending on how you look at it, it could be a bad thing, but it could also be a good thing, seeing that on some devices like the Pixels and Samsung's devices, Android 12 is a bit buggy. So in a way, you're kind of getting a more stable version of Android, one that's outdated. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but yeah, still nonetheless a bit of a weird decision, and just something that you should know before you get the device. Okay, so in terms of bloatware, unfortunately we do have quite a bit of it. And just to clarify, I won't be considering the Google Apps as bloatware, just because you're most likely going to be downloading some of these anyway, like YouTube Music, photos and stuff. So we're just going to ignore that. But if you can go to the second screen over here, you can see there's quite a number of bloatware apps, things like Facebook, Amazon, Agoda, Trip.com, along with these ones over here, which are grayed out. These are actually suggestions, but still, it's kind of annoying to see along with these promoted apps over here. So obviously, you can just pretty much uninstall and get rid of these ones over here. You can see, just uninstall that. Not too hard, but still it's a bit of a hassle having to do that like maybe 20 plus times. You can see there's even a bunch of pre-installed games as well. Now, these ones over here, the promoted apps, I think the only way to actually get rid of them is to actually remove the folder itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and try to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove it. So yeah, just remove the entire folder, and that's probably the only way to get rid of these promoted apps. But yeah, that's kind of annoying. It's not too bad. I mean, you can uninstall all of it, but still you have to do the process probably like 20 plus times. So yeah, just keep that in mind. There's quite a bit of bloatware. Also, if you're wondering why I don't have a SIM card inserted in the POCO X4 Pro 5G, it's because as of the recording of this video, I've already moved my secondary SIM to another device, which I'll be reviewing on the channel soon. So if you're interested, do subscribe, and hopefully that video will be out in about 2 weeks time. Alright, so when it comes to the battery for the POCO X4 Pro 5G, my experience has been very pleasant so far, and I think it's mainly due to the fact that the 5000 mAh battery paired with the lower powered Snapdragon 695 results in really good battery life, because obviously it doesn't consume as much power. So even with 120 Hz on, the battery life is really good. In the past 2 weeks that I've had this, it hasn't died on me once. And even on heavier days where I'm using the camera a lot, doing a lot of multitasking, and I come back home at about 11 PM, I still have about 10% left, which is honestly really good compared to some of the other Android devices I've used. One example is the Pixel 6, which it has a slightly smaller battery, but the battery life it definitely isn't as good as this. For that device, I occasionally have had to charge it around dinner time, and usually wouldn't last me all the way up to midnight, especially if I'm using the cameras a lot. And also another thing to note is the standby battery drain on this is also really good. So with this device, typically if I leave it overnight, I'm usually losing about 3 to 4%, which is honestly really good compared to some of the other Android devices I've used in the past few months, such as the OnePlus Nord 2, which from my memory usually loses about 7 to 8% overnight. Okay, so the POCO X4 Pro 5G also comes with a 67 watt charger in the box, which is nice given the fact that some other manufacturers like Samsung have stopped including it in their entry to mid-range devices. So it's definitely nice that you still get a charger, and a fast charger at that, with Xiaomi and POCO devices. And as for the charging speeds, I pretty much ran the battery down to 0%, and I plugged in the charger, and it took pretty much 10 minutes over here. It took 10 minutes to reach from 0 to 20%. So yeah, just in case you're curious of how fast the charging speeds were if you were to kind of plug it in when it's dead. When it comes to the display for the POCO X4 Pro 5G, I honestly have zero complaints, because it's just a really good display at this price point. And this is probably one of the notable improvements over last year's POCO X3 Pro. So last year's POCO X3 Pro actually had an LCD display, but this year we've upgraded to a 120Hz OLED display, which is really nice. You get some really nice inky blacks, and it's just perfect for consuming media. And in terms of brightness as well, it gets plenty bright under direct sunlight. I've honestly had no issues using the device in direct sunlight, and it also gets dim enough for my liking, especially when you're kind of like just lying on your bed scrolling through Twitter or Instagram. It gets dim enough for that. And this is something which even the iPhone 13 Pro seems to struggle at. So when I'm using my iPhone 13 Pro, I realize it doesn't get nearly as dim as some Android devices, such as this one over here. So yeah, that's definitely a plus if you're someone who uses your phone a lot in the dark before going to bed. It's not exactly a very healthy habit. I mean, I'm guilty of it too, but it is what it is. But yeah, in terms of display, I have no complaints at all. 120Hz OLED display is just really good. Had that gorgeous display with the dual stereo speakers on here, and you're gonna get a really good media consumption device. Okay, so some other things to note about the POCO X4 Pro is, of course, you get a side-mounted fingerprint scanner. So it's not an in-display fingerprint scanner, but honestly, I do prefer side-mounted fingerprint scanners. You know, some people might think they're a bit dated, and no, I don't blame them. Obviously, an in-display fingerprint scanner is going to look and kind of feel cooler, but you know, in terms of reliability, this has been really good, especially since the last Android device I've used was the Pixel 6, which, if you all know, the fingerprint scanner on there is, you know, it's really hit or miss. So, you know, going back to a Android device with a really good fingerprint scanner is definitely nice. So yeah, you're going to get a really good fingerprint scanner on this device. Another thing to note is that the haptics on this is honestly really good for this price point. And I think this is something, you know, Xiaomi and POCO have been really good at. Even last year's Redmi Note 10 Pro, which I've used for quite a bit, you know, had really good haptics, and you know, the same can be said for this year's POCO X4 Pro, which has, you know, the haptics are just really good, and it's honestly a lot better than some other devices out there. The ones that come to my mind are Samsung's A series. Like, they're decent devices, but if you ever used a Samsung A series device before, the haptics aren't as refined as the ones you get on Xiaomi and POCO devices. Honestly, at this price point, the haptics are really good. Okay, so in terms of pricing, the POCO X4 Pro 5G starts at around $285 for the 6 gigs and 128 gigs of storage variant. And obviously, depending on where you live, you could get it for cheaper as well. You know, price-wise, I think it's alright. It's definitely better value than some of its competitors out there. The ones that come to my mind are the Samsung A33 and of course the Oppo Reno 7Z, both of which are actually priced more expensive than this device, but you know, fall short in some regards. The A33, for example, has a kind of dated looking teardrop notch and also has only a 90Hz display, whereas the Oppo Reno 7Z has a Snapdragon 680 processor, something which is weaker than the 695, and it also lacks an ultra-wide camera. So in terms of value, the POCO X4 Pro 5G is still a pretty good device, despite it kind of falling short when you compare it to last year's offerings. But in terms of 2022 offerings, it's probably one of the better ones out there. Alright, so that's it for the review. As I've said before, this is by no means a bad device. It's still plenty capable in its own right, but when you compare it to last year's POCO X3 Pro, it's obvious that this one doesn't offer as much value, which is a shame, because I was expecting this device to be obviously more of a successor, you know, maybe a better chipset. Something like a Snapdragon 870 would be nice, or even a Snapdragon 778. But you know, having said that, this device is still going to appeal to quite a number of consumers. You know, if you're someone who's wanting to buy a smartphone for your kid, or like an older relative, like a parent or grandparent, this is still going to be a good choice, obviously because of the good battery life, the nice big display, decent cameras which perform pretty well in broad daylight. But you know, if you're part of the audience which, you know, prioritizes performance over everything else, this is not going to be a good choice. You know, I still highly suggest getting last year's POCO X3 Pro, or maybe even saving up an extra $30 and getting the POCO F3 with the Snapdragon 870. So yeah, you know, overall it's still a decent device, but probably not a good choice for, you know, loyal POCO fans who have always wanted a good price to performance ratio. So yeah, you know, that's it for the video. Hope you guys did enjoy this one. You know, do let me know in the comments if you guys still plan to pick up the POCO X4 Pro 5G, or are you guys, you know, kind of reconsidering and thinking of getting the POCO X3 Pro instead. So yeah, that's all. See you guys next one. Bye.